chairman of the History and Social Sciences Department here at GPS for the last 21 years and teaches AP U.S. Government, AP Comparative Government, AP Modern European History, and Constitutional Law, which is her special area of interest. She is the official Chattanooga and Hamilton County historian and was recently recognized as an outstanding humanities educator by Humanities Tennessee. Linda serves on the Board of Trustees for the Erlanger-Hamilton County Hospital Authority, Chattanooga Habitat for Humanity as the past president of the board. She chairs the Mayor's Council on Women's History and co-chairs the Chattanooga-Hamilton County 50th Anniversary Commemoration Committee for the Vietnam War. She's an active member of the DAR and in July will become the Tennessee Society's historian. 44 years after being in her career as an educator, Linda admits to being a history nerd and loving her profession. Let's extend a very warm welcome to historian Linda.
I actually have a script because those of you that know me, I think this may be why Deborah put me last, is that when the shoes come off and I get the microphone, I usually have to have someone in the audience going, because once a teacher, always a teacher, and my children even sometimes at Sunday dinner will go, Mom, it's lunch. It's not a history lesson. You don't really have to offer commentary. So I actually did have a script to talk a little bit about the history of women in education and the history of education for women. But I have to start by telling you that I think our passions sort of come to us vicariously through our family experiences from a multitude of different directions, because I am an educator. I think I was destined to be an educator. I am a history nerd, but I am forever an educator, a teacher, and I am forever a student. I am most proud that my most recent act as a student is I have just obtained my certification as an artillery master for the National Park Service. So I am now one of 2 women in the country that can fire the big guns. All my life I wanted the big guns. I probably love education. I will tell you this, and then I'll get back to my script, because I grew up in a family. I'm an only child. I'm a historian, I'm a genealogist. I grew up on a farm next door to my grandparents, and I was absolutely blessed by the family I was born into. Actually, I'm thinking I'm finding family up here because Susan Chipley and I worked together for several years, and I was at Old Mills for a number of years before I went to McKee Baking. Somehow snack cakes seem to be more appealing. And then I came back to education, but I had a wonderful family that valued learning, but had not really ever been able to be incredibly well educated. My mother, who lives with me now and is still educating me what my appropriate role as a child is, only went to school until the 8th grade because she was born into a family in which my grandfather was a very conservative, faith-driven man who didn't believe that women needed to have an education. My uncle went to high school and went on to school. My mother and her sister were allowed only to go through the 8th grade. My mother was determined when she married my father that any children they had were going to go to school, whatever it took to get them to school. She married into a family that my grandmother York loved reading, loved education, and had me reading by the age of 3. Had me in school by the age of 5, in college at 16, out of college at 19 and teaching. So when I tell people this is my 44th year, I do like to say I'm not quite yet 65. I'm only 63. But that education was just a drive. You know, there was never a discussion of was I going to college, was I going to get a master's, was I going to work on my doctorate. It was simply a given because that had been my mother's dream, and it had been a dream denied. And she is very typical for rural communities in the age in which she lived. So I like to tell people that I am probably one of the few people in Chattanooga, certainly probably the only person in this this classroom area that's a product of a one-room schoolhouse. My first 3 years were spent in a one-room schoolhouse, 24 students, 1 teacher, 8 grades. And my first grade teacher predicted that I would become a teacher because she told my mother she could either make me sit in my seat or make me be quiet, but she could not do both. It was impossible, and that I like to hop from pod to pod. whichever group I thought was the appropriate math level or the science level. I don't know how Miss Ova Thomas taught 8 grades in one room, 24 students, but I am here to tell you that every day when I teach, I hope I channel her, because she was the most phenomenal instructor I ever had, and she had only gone to college for 2 years. Out of my first grade class with 3, 2 were National Merit Scholars. And I attribute it to her love of learning, her ability to individualize, and the fact that she didn't categorize us. So if I could read with a 4th grade level, I did. If I was doing math with a 3rd grade level, I went all the way through calculus. She allowed us to move around, and that's important, and that's something that we need to think about. I still see that as a model in education, not pigeonholing, teaching the whole child, allowing the whole child to determine. And that's still my philosophy today. You know, my daughter's sitting here in the classroom, and there was never any discussion about what she was going to go on to school forever and ever and ever. Although I do tell her, and you have my permission to use this, there will be no decision about what nursing home I go to. It's my home, I know. It's my home. She is my retirement plan. And that's okay, because that's what I wanted. Pardon? Thank you. We should talk. We should talk. So what I am going to do is get on script just a little bit. So it's never a surprise when I talk to people and I say, I want to talk about education, I want to talk about history. Normally what they say is, here it comes. So I pulled a few things that I just really wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's always fascinating when we talk about women in education, because I'm of the theory that women have been educators since the beginning of time. Now, they may not have been teaching those hunting skills about hunting woolly mammoths, but they were pretty much teaching everything else, because that's what women do. Women teach. Women share their knowledge. Women are inclusive in the way they do things. Bill, I'm sorry, I have to give a shout out to Bill, because several years ago when his daughter was one of my AP students, you may not remember this, what I normally have AP European students' parents do when they come on Parents' Day is I give them a blank sheet of paper and they have to draw a map of Europe with all the countries and capitals. In the 26 years that I've been at GPS, Bill Hicks had the best map any parent had ever drawn. He knew everything, and Ardina tried to scratch his name out and write her name. And then she said, well, he can't find his way around town because he won't ask directions, but of course he has the map. We teach in different ways. I like to think that often citizens seldom consider, and probably don't even really understand, that it's really until recently that women have been able to access so many different levels of the educational system. I'll get back on script here. When Harvard opened its doors in 1638, the first college to admit women didn't open for another 200 years. I want you to think about that for a moment. Women did not begin attending college in the same numbers equal to men until 1981. I know there are those of you in the room who were not born in 1981. I have to admit I was teaching then, and maybe a couple of other folks were. But I find that fascinating, and I lived through that to realize that education is something today that young women often take for granted, my students included, and they don't think about all the hard work that it's taken for women to attain the right to an education. As recently as 50 years ago, women often encountered educational barriers that proclaimed messages of things like, well, women were not capable of participating in politics. They certainly weren't interested in really having a career of their own. They were simply supplementing the household income. And they were not capable of handling their retirement or investment funds on their own. The message that was consistently given to women, even in educational settings, often was the serious things you really need to let your husband make that decision for you. It still happens. I hear Aaron saying over here, I'm sorry, that was my most withering glance. You know, the worst thing in the world for most of us in this room is for someone to say, you really shouldn't do that because you're a girl. My response to that normally, and I know your response is too, because you're here, is sort of, you better hide and watch or get out of the way, because I will if I hurt myself in the process, which I have been known to do a time or two. You know, women who were lucky enough to get a quality education were likely to be active citizen activists and to try and make history in their own right, because once they realized what was out there, it became important to spread the knowledge. Again, women are natural teachers. So by quickly understanding 3 or 4 things in the history of education for women and the history of women in education, then we can really figure out how far we've come, what remains to be done, and some of the extraordinary women that we probably encountered in our journey. So I don't want to bore you with a lot of facts. Krista's back there, and she knows that occasionally within the classroom I'm tempted to sort of do handstands and song and dance and fall on the floor and all of that. So I try never to be boring. But there are some things you really need to think about. Prior to the 1830s, women were not allowed in most places to be school teachers because the assumption was that, 1, men could better educate predominantly male classrooms, and 2, that women simply could not handle young boys in the classroom. I don't know who was handling them at home. I never understood it when they said, well, you know, women cannot handle young men in groups, and I'm thinking, they never met my grandmother, who could have lined everybody up and thumped them. She might not have called each child by the right name because she sometimes got a little frustrated. If any of you have large families, my grandmother would go up and she would call the right until she got the right name. While there was a reluctance to hire women to teach, population began to geometrically progress, and all of a sudden, by about 1835, there were 30,000 less teachers than there were teaching jobs, and the assumption was made that maybe they were going to have to hire women to do that. That became an acceptable trend because what most school districts realized was that they could hire a female teacher for 1/3 the salary of a man. And that began in 1835. The reason was, of course, that the woman was either supplementing her husband's income, or if she was single, she was still living at home with her family, or if she was single and not with her family, someone in the community would take her in to live in their home, and she would be sort of like the maiden aunt, teacher / tutor for that family. The first women's college, Mount Holyoke, offered a more serious collegiate education, but it didn't mirror the curriculum that was offered and available for young men. Women getting into college, into women's colleges at that point in history in the mid-19th century, usually had to sit for a much more rigorous academic admission test than young men did, because there were actually only a few select women who were capable of handling college education. I still love to tell my students in history, there's a lovely School of London program, a medical program in the 1830s that said women really didn't need to talk about serious things like science, math, politics, and those sorts of things, because from an anatomy and physiology standpoint, the women's brains would implode and then would turn to liquid and would ooze out their ears and nose. And it was signed by a number of members of the Royal Academy of Sciences in London by acclaimed doctors, and I'm thinking, how many of them had observed that happen? I'm sort of a laboratory science person. I'm an old chemistry major also, and I'm just wondering how many people they'd seen their brains run out of their noses because women had gone to school. If it was difficult for women, white women, to obtain an education, it was even more difficult for African American women in the 19th century. Opening a school to teach African American young women was a risky business in itself, and those who did were often faced with threats and retaliation. One of my personal heroes always, I feel as though Prudence and I know each other. We never met. She died in the 1860s, but some of my favorite people are dead. That's the life of the historian. She opened a school in 1833 in Boston, and actually was attacked by mobs because she was educating young African American girls. She eventually had to close her school. She was perfectly willing to take that risk as an individual, and she herself be spat upon, to be beaten, to be hit, to be abused in all sorts of ways. But when the attacks began on her students, she decided that she couldn't do that. So her school went underground, and she continued to educate. That's really difficult to fathom today, to think about that. when the delegates met at Seneca Falls, they called for co-education because the boys' schools had such better resources, had better facilities, actually had textbooks, where so often the girls' schools didn't. Private schools for most young women up until the 1900s were normally called finishing schools. You all have read a lot about finishing schools. I pulled one example, and I love this. I think I'm going to take it home and read it to my husband tonight. And it said that finishing schools were designed to help young women prepare not for college, but to become, as this curriculum guide said, suitably wives. You know, you can't take it out on people that you love, but suitably submissive wives, what the heck does that mean? But that's a good point for me to pause, because we're sitting now in a facility that countered a lot of that. I'm a public school graduate all the way through. I direct our partnerships here at this school in the community, and we partner with public and charter schools. But I have this special place in my heart for 3 young ladies who were teachers. In 1906, they were teaching at Chattanooga City High. And they were frustrated because the girls who were attending Chattanooga City High, the first public through 12 high school in the Southeast, young women were not allowed to take laboratory sciences, and they were not allowed to take calculus. So at that point, Eula Mae Jarnigan, Grace McCauley, and Tommy Duffy decided that they would pool their resources, which were pretty meager, and start a girls' school. And they started that girls' school in one of their homes. They took in students, and they began to teach the full academic range of college preparatory programs. They encountered a tremendous amount of flack from the community, even here in Chattanooga. In fact, at one point, there was a request made actually to the sheriff, who at that point happened to be Brooke McCauley, so that was probably not, the arrest wasn't going to happen. But Chattanooga had a law in the books that said anytime more than 2 women were living together without a male to actually supervise the household, that house was legally considered to be a brothel. So I would love to say that I teach at a school that started out as a brothel. You know, we were going to make money one day. It's just really interesting when you think about all of that, because the rest of what they began in 1906 with their vision that young women could major in STEM-related programs, that women could handle calculus, that women could be community leaders, that women could partner with their husbands, they could by themselves become entrepreneurs, is something that is the rest of GPS history. So here we are today, 110 years later, still having those same sorts of messages. But I have to tell you that their victory here didn't change everything in the world at that point. As late as the 1970s, I was around by that time, female educators still earned low wages, had a lack of political and community support. There were strict rules on appearances. And I'm going to leave you with, as much as everything has changed, the fact that the very first contract that I signed in 1972 said, I had to sign and have notarized, I am not pregnant, and I will resign my job immediately upon learning that I am pregnant in Tennessee in the 1970s, because a pregnant woman in a classroom was considered to be a distraction to the educational process. We've come a long way, but the challenge is to make sure this isn't where we stop, that the stories are told, and that our daughters and our sons have an equal access to the dreams they have in their heads and they have in their hearts, because we've paved the way. It's not finished just yet.